Hello, you're listening to the Public Rail Now podcast. I'm your host, Adam Barrington, National Organizer for Public Rail Now. On this episode, I'm joined by Ben Carroll from the Southern Workers Assembly. We discuss labor organizing in the South, building rank and file power, the upcoming Southern Worker Action Summit in Spartanburg, South Carolina, and much more. For more information about the Southern Workers Assembly, please visit southernworker.org. And to get registered for the Southern Worker Action Summit, taking place June 13th to 15th in Spartanburg, please visit southernworker.org/summit/#register. There will be some amazing workshops and presentations, including one by Public Rail Now. I'm very much looking forward to it. For more information on Public Rail Now, please visit publicrailnow.org. All right, Ben, thank you so much for your time today. I'm very excited to have you on the show, and not just because of the upcoming Southern Workers Assembly Summit in Spartanburg, but because I greatly admire the work that SWA does, and it's really, truly imperative work organizing labor in the South. And before we get into the details about the upcoming summit, can you tell our listeners a little bit about Southern Workers Assembly?
Yeah, and thanks so much, for having us on the program today. And we really are excited about the work that Public Rail Now is doing, that Railroad Workers United, and really, the opportunities for us to connect our work together and really build a powerful movement that can win, not only public rail, but all the things that workers, throughout the country deserve. And I guess, just to share more about the Southern Workers Assembly. So, the Southern Workers Assembly at its core is a network of rank and file workers that are organizing in strategic workplaces across the region, and connected together through various different kinds of networks. Our kind of our kind of fundamental approach, or our methodology and our kind of outlook is that, on the one hand, obviously the U.S. South is the least unionized region of the country. It's dominated and has been dominated by reactionary politicians, which is a direct outgrowth of the lack of organization in the region. That's resulted in, across the board, the lowest measures of quality of life for workers here. And, also impacts workers across the rest of the country, because the South, as we've seen, time and time again, is really used to undermine, workers' ability and, standards of living and, so on and so forth in other parts of the country. So, it's really not only in the interests of workers here to, reverse, that kind of history of the lack of organization, but, in the interests of workers, throughout the country and around the world to organize in the region. I think our kind of fundamental approach, that we take towards building these different kinds of networks is that, I think we've seen, from what we've seen, this the kind of approach that a lot of the labor movement has adopted in recent years of, organizing in one workplace at a time, doesn't work and isn't going to get us, isn't going to address the, continuously declining rates of unionization in this country. And if we look back through history, the ways that and the times that there were these massive upsurges of organizing and worker militancy, it was a similar methodology that was employed, whether it's in the 30s and 40s with the Flint sit-down strike, the Winston-Salem tobacco workers and countless other examples. But, our kind of thinking is that, and our day-to-day work is that we're trying to develop, cadres or corps of leadership across a variety of different strategic workplaces in the South, and connecting those workers that are, rooted inside of these strategic workplaces together through different kinds of networks that are really oriented towards taking and engaging in collective action. So, on the local level, that takes the form of the workers' assemblies that, are active in about 15 or 16 different Southern cities. On a regional level, we've been developing out industrial councils. So, networks that connect workers together in the same sectors to be able to exchange lessons, to share strategies, to coordinate demands and activities, throughout and building various other kinds of networks, as conditions or, the needs of the struggle kind of dictate or demand. And really this approach is that, these workers are active in building committees and rooted inside of these various workplaces. And that when there are breakthrough moments that occur, can really kind of are in position to take advantage of those breakthrough moments and really lead to sweeps of organizing that can bring, thousands of workers into the union all at once. I think, this is what we see, as I mentioned, at different points in history. I think also too, just, more contemporarily, to think if this kind of a network was in place and rooted in various workplaces on the heels of, for example, the stand-up strike that the UAW conducted in late 2023. I think, there's all kinds of reports that, tens of thousands of auto workers across the country, and particularly in the South, were contacting the UAW, were interested in organizing. And, if this kind of network was in place, I think, some of that interest in organizing and building unions at auto plants and other sectors that were inspired by the courageous fight that workers at the Big Three led, it could have, taken advantage of that opening to really, bring forward these kinds of sweeps of organizing. And so that's really our approach to organizing. And, the SWA was formed in 2012 and was primarily the initiative of two organizations, UE Local 150, that organizes public sector workers in North Carolina, who by a Jim Crow era statute are forbidden by law to collectively bargain, as well as Black Workers for Justice. And, the first kind of gathering of the Southern Workers Assembly was held in opposition to the Democratic National Convention as they were meeting in Charlotte, North Carolina. And, in 2012, it was obviously on kind of in the midst of the economic crisis that began in 2007, 2008. The Democrats were, trying to cast themselves, as they often do, as, the kind of voice of the working class, or that they, somehow spoke for workers. But meanwhile, we're meeting in the state with the least, the lowest union density. They're meeting in a city that's the second, highest concentration of finance capital behind Wall Street in New York, that doesn't have a single unionized hotel, and a city that, for years prior to that, had, obstructed the efforts by city workers to win payroll dues deduction. And so, on the one hand, UE and other, labor and community allies, really took advantage of the spectacle of the DNC and all the attention that was on Charlotte as a result, and held, a series of pickets and other actions at city council in the months leading up to the actual DNC, which was held in September of that year, demanding, the right to dues checkoffs on their paychecks for union dues. And they won, as a result of, their fight that they kind of, took on a national and even a world stage with all the attention on the city of Charlotte. But, at the Southern Workers Assembly gathering that took place during the DNC was an effort to kind of bring forward, a voice for workers to speak in their own voice, to raise up, their demands, as the Democrats were meeting, only, several miles away in the convention center. And I think, through that kind of mobilization, there was a real recognition that we needed to develop some infrastructure to connect these different, efforts to build working class organization in the region together, that there was a lot of value in, that kind of connections between workers in the same sector and in other sectors to be able to coordinate, strategize, share lessons, and just kind of build, that kind of solidarity and that kind of an institution that can really sustain and advance the organizing efforts that were happening across the region. I think too, just in view of the historical failure of the labor movement to make meaningful investments into the region to organize, there's a real recognition again from, the various worker organizations and other forces that participated in that gathering, that it was going to really take, a bottom-up effort to build infrastructure, to start building and supporting committee development in various workplaces, to build workers' assemblies, to connect those committee building efforts together, and to really make appeals to the labor movement nationally to make the kinds of investments in a long-term way that can turn the tide, on the lack of organization in the region, that can challenge, the backwards politicians that, on the one hand have obviously made the South kind of the bastion of anti-labor laws, but, all kinds of other reactionary legislation originates in the region and is then exported across the country. And so that was really how the Southern Workers Assembly formed in the first place. I think one other thing too, just to kind of wrap up on this point, I think this is a pretty shocking statistic. I mean, it was shocking to me when I first heard it, but the southern states combined have the same number of union members as the state of New York. So that's 13 different states that have the same number of union members as just one state. And so in light of that, I think that the Southern Workers Assembly and the efforts of the various different worker organizations and workers that are part of the assembly is an effort to turn the tide on those kinds of on that reality and those statistics, and to really challenge and push back and to build a movement of workers that is not solely concerned with just the conditions in one plant or this or that workplace, but that is building organization on the shop floor that's connected together and is really bringing forward the demands of workers as a whole. So connecting different workplace fights together, connecting to the broader community, and really building a movement that can support workplace organizing and kind of bring forward workers that are in motion to fight to build power at work and in a society more generally.
Yeah, when I first heard of SWA, I immediately thought of Operation Dixie, the CIO's plan to organize the South, and that unfortunately flops because of Jim Crow and other factors. But Operation Dixie aside, there have been historical examples of attempts to organize workers in the South, and I'm thinking now about that book Hammer and Hoe about workers organizing in Alabama during the Great Depression, and that's a sort of a lost history of labor, and I'm wondering. What past lessons has SWA adapted to today's conditions in the South? And are those historical examples of worker organizing in the South still relevant?
Yeah, no, I think you're totally right. And I mean, I think that in spite of, the low level of union density in the region, the South has been the home of some of the most militant worker struggles, this country has ever seen. I mean, even stepping back further, I think it was W.E.B. Du Bois that characterized, that the enslaved Africans were the first to lead a general strike in the revolts that happened in the 1860s. And, that legacy is really carried through today. And, Black workers in particular have been on the forefront of, so many of the most militant and inspiring struggles that have happened, throughout the South that, challenged not only repression and exploitation in the workplace, but also, white supremacy and Jim Crow, and linking those fights together, to build, some of the, various movements that have risen throughout history. That I think it's also important to note, the gains and the victories of many of those movements, are now, under direct attack from the Trump administration and the billionaire class. Who very much, have, are very much trying to, roll back every measure of progress that's been won through struggle. But yeah, to your question, I mean, we certainly do study many of those historical examples and, draw out a variety of different lessons from them. I think first and foremost, as you mentioned with Operation Dixie, a couple of things are, clear from that experience that, avoiding the question of racism in the workplace is inexcusable and is not a way to win and to build worker organization. And, making the fight against racism, front and center and part and parcel of the fight to build power in the workplace is essential. I mean, obviously, the bosses are, use racism and other forms of social oppression to keep us divided. And without confronting that, we have no chance to build the type of solidarity that's needed to build power and fight back and really build long-term organization. I think also too, in numerous examples, some of which I mentioned earlier, with the CIO organizing and particularly the Winston-Salem tobacco workers, they adopted, a similar method where, for many years there were workers inside of R.J. Reynolds, which was the largest cigarette manufacturer in the world at that time, that were in various strategic parts of the workplace, and that, they were building very slowly, committees and organization. And, when there was an opportunity to really bring forward a broader struggle, workers were positioned throughout the plan in various strategic areas. And we're able to really utilize that opening to usher forward, the wave of militancy and organization that won the first contract there. And, another piece that's very important too to note about Winston-Salem and numerous other examples too is the connection to the community. The workers, themselves obviously were, very much integrated with the community, and the community very much saw themselves a part of the workers' fight. And I think, in some of the defeats that we've seen in various organizing campaigns over the last couple of decades, some of our own kind of reflections or assessment of some of that is that has been a missing piece among other factors, that really in the South in particular, we can't expect to win, workplace fights in isolation from the broader community, and really kind of building those ties between the workplace and the community, finding ways to link together those struggles, for workers in the workplace to be elevating and bringing in those kinds of broader community demands, and, vice versa, is really, pretty key to really building a powerful movement that can, push back against the forces of capital, which are quite strong, and, are determined to try to, to keep unions and, to keep workers from forming organizations. So, I think those are, a couple of the lessons that we draw from that, but there are, so many rich lessons throughout, Southern worker history that are, deserve study and attention, and that we try to, really make a kind of key part of analyzing and assessing and drawing and applying to our work today.
You've touched on this a bit, and I kind of want to dig deeper into it, because there's this general understanding that the South is an incredibly difficult place to organize and build worker power, and especially among folks like me who live up north, compared to the North, we think, down South it's almost impossible. But does that impression hold true to you, and from your experience? And are there any factors in organizing in the South that make it different or more difficult than organizing in the North?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you're right that without a doubt, there's certain, structural obstacles, some of which we touched on already around, some of the different laws. I mean, even just, the fact of in different parts of the country up north, et cetera, where people know people in unions, or they have a family member who's in a union, or their cousin or whoever is in a union. I mean, you don't really have that so much here. So, a lot of times when we're out doing gate leafleting or, talking to workers, it's not uncommon, to hear, workers ask, like, isn't being a part of a union illegal here? But, I think in spite of, some of the obstacles that do exist, and, just the determination from the politicians and big business who, use the anti-union character of the region and the low union density as a selling point, to attract, all kinds of investments from corporations. There is very much a determination and an interest and a desire to organize and to fight back. I mean, I think that, there's obviously the statistics that I think probably most folks have heard numerous times by now, that, there's 60 to 70% of workers, if they could join a union, they would. And, I think that's been our experience here too, from the various kinds of outreach and organizing that we've been supporting and involved in through the Southern Workers Assembly. But, I think it is going to really take a long-term fight. I think a lot of times there's expectation that, if this or that, union kind of puts down some staff and tries to do something, and, it'll turn out, this way or that way. But I think, there's a real need to build long-term sustained organizing and long-term investments, from the unions and other organizations to really help to build a workplace organization, just because, there is that kind of ingrained, there is quite a bit of opposition from, the politicians and the powers that be to organizing in the region. But, and that's really, I think, what, our work in the Southern Workers Assembly is focused on, is really how to build that kind of long-term infrastructure and that long-term, sustained work to build committees, to build leadership, to, connect workers together with one another, to really, sustain kind of the long-term work that's needed to turn the tide and push back against the the reactionary climate in the region. But I think like I mentioned, we do pretty regular gate leafletings in the various different cities that we have workers' assemblies, and the response obviously varies place to place, but there's in most cases the workers that we talk to are incredibly excited to talk about what's happening at work, to see that there's other workers who are outside of their workplace who are organizing, who are engaging them to start to organize. And I think the real missing key, or the missing kind of piece here, is just the kind of infrastructure and the institutions to really sustain and to help to develop the interest among workers to organize that does exist across industries, across cities, across states, across across the region.
Yeah, and I'm interested in hearing about the Southern Workers Assembly's relationship with existing unions in the South. And I know that you had mentioned that one of the major goals of SWA is building rank and file power. And so I'm wondering if there's what does that internal organizing within the unions look like? And, is there a decent relationship with the unions? Is there any kind of friction that happens? Just wanted to know more about that.
Yeah, no, we have, relationships with a number of different unions across the region. We have, the Southern Workers Assembly has several kind of formal union affiliates. That includes the Union of Southern Service Workers, UE Local 150, the International Longshoremen's Association, Local 1422 out of Charleston, the National Nurses United, and as well as the Charleston Worker Center and Black Workers for Justice. But beyond, those, different unions, we, in the various, cities that we're active in and across the region, we also have, various relationships with other unions as well. At the same time, too, there are a number of workers that are involved in the SWA who are or have been part of, a variety of different efforts to develop rank and file leadership or form reform caucuses within the unions. So, there's a variety of different activity that's happening. But, I think that there's a recognition that in the region, on the one hand, that, in a way that I think perhaps differs from other parts of the country, is that, there is, unions and the right to organize are under such attack, and workers in general are under such attack in the region, that there is a real need to, stick together, to build solidarity, to find, points that we can have some level of unity around. So I think that, and it's the conditions themselves kind of produce, some level of solidarity kind of intrinsically between, different forces, despite whatever, different views or, whatever they may have. But, in our interest, we do want to work with the unions. We want, the unions to make meaningful long-term, commitments to organizing in the region. And I don't think that our approach to really, develop and bring forward a current that is, that is really driving, rank and file leadership within the, within various types of worker organizations isn't any kind of conflict with that. We, our approach, with the, cadre development and network building is really, we're focused primarily on unorganized workplaces. And so, engaging workers to take those first step forwards, to start developing committees, to learn about various, organizing skills, to engage in other types of political education, to connect together and to learn from workers who are members of unions, to, kind of exchange with them around lessons or fights they've been engaged in their workplaces that they can take back to, addressing various issues inside of their own workplaces. And so, there is, I think, a very on the ground and, even on the regional level, very fluid exchange between, a number of the unions, union locals, individual rank and file union members, as well as, the kind of broader, unorganized workers that the assemblies are working to support in committee development and other efforts to start to build organizations. So I think, yeah, I think it takes a lot of different forms, but there is, certainly a lot of engagement and interaction with various unions. And, many of the unions have been quite supportive and very helpful, with some of the different work that we're doing. And with the upcoming Southern Worker Action Summit, there are a number of unions that are planning to participate, send delegations, and contribute in a variety of different ways to that gathering that's coming up.
That's excellent to hear. And it's something else I wanted to ask, because you'd mentioned strategic industries. When people think about neoliberal globalization and so-called capital flight and factories getting moved, and et cetera, they often think about production getting moved to places like northern Mexico, to South Asia, but corporations also move production to the South, where union power is weaker. They can pay lower wages. They can extract more profits. So even though there's this idea that there's no manufacturing centers left to organize in this country, it seems like there are opportunities in the South for anyone itching to become a labor organizer. Do you agree with that assessment? And sort of as a follow-up, what are those really strategic industries in the South that are the ripest for organizing workers?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I 100% agree with that assessment. I mean, I think, the I-85 corridor in particular, which stretches from just south of Richmond, Virginia, and Petersburg, Virginia, to Montgomery, Alabama, is kind of famously, a lot of the big business press will always kind of talk about the economic importance of I-85. And if you look at, a map of the 85 with various kind of industries mapped out, there is a very clear concentration of all kinds of logistics and manufacturing along the 85 corridor. And Spartanburg, which is where we're going to be having the summit coming up next month, we did a blitz there, which, is a multi-day kind of sustained effort to do outreach to workers across a variety of different workplaces in March of this year. And that was really my first time spending a decent amount of time in the city. And I was amazed just that, like, it was, you throw a rock basically and you hit some, huge important manufacturer. I mean, obviously the BMW plant, their largest in the world, is headquartered there. And as a result, there's numerous other, auto parts and, related manufacturers in the area. And, beyond even auto, it's attracted all kinds of, manufacturing to the region. And then, the other piece of it too is that, in addition to the I-85 corridor itself, you have so much, these key ports across the entire southern coast, and through the Gulf of Mexico. I mean, I think Savannah, I could be wrong about this, but I think Savannah is one of the top 5 busiest by volume ports in the country. Obviously there's been all kinds of auto plants that have been being built in the South over the last 30 years. And recently, a number of electric vehicle plants, including, Hyundai is building an electric vehicle plant that initially was supposed to employ, or was going to employ, 8,000 workers. And, in the recent months, they've upped that to 14,000 workers, producing 500,000 cars every year. So there's tons of manufacturing in the region. And, obviously there's a lot of turmoil and changes that are happening right now. And so, we'll see what happens. I mean, there have been some, pretty significant announcements within the last couple of months of other major capital investments that are coming into the region in all kinds of different sectors. So, I can imagine that we can expect those kinds of trends to continue. But, to your question about strategic industries, I mean, yeah, I think it's a great question. And I think that in some ways it's subjective, and it, depends on, what you mean by strategic. And I think, various people may have different, answers to this question. But, from our point of view, we really, we have been really kind of taking a focus on the auto industry in particular, and just the tremendous expansion of the auto industry in the region over the last 30 years for many of the reasons that, you spoke to in the question prior to this. And, just looking at that as a particularly strategic industry and, related kind of goods production that's happening in the region. I think another particularly strategic industry in the South is pharmaceutical manufacturing and chips production too. That both of which are just seeing just tremendous, investments on the order of billions and billions of dollars of capital that are being invested into existing and new facilities on both fronts. And we've, as I mentioned, we've taken a particular focus on the auto industry and a particular focus on the electric vehicle industry, that has expanded rapidly over the past couple of years across the region. I mentioned the Hyundai plant in Savannah. Ford is also building, I believe it's their largest auto plant ever outside of Memphis, Tennessee. That's called the Blue Oval SK facility. And, many of the major manufacturers, auto manufacturers are, locating electric vehicle production and other, conventional auto production in the South. I mean, obviously there was the historic victory by the UAW at the VW plant, last year. And, I think that, kind of building off of that momentum and really carrying, the broader organizing that the UAW has been doing into these, Southern auto plants and auto suppliers and related industries is, a key focus of ours and has been, over the last year, and I think will continue to be as we move forward.
You had beat me to mentioning W.E.B. Du Bois earlier, but he famously said, "As the South goes, so goes the nation." And so I'm wondering, from your perspective, if organizers and workers in the South are successful in building labor power and militant working class consciousness in their workplaces and their unions, what kinds of impacts or changes do you think we might see in the labor movement and relations of production in general across the United States?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I think, I think that, as we've touched on at different points throughout, the lack of organization in the region, is to the detriment of workers and communities here first and foremost, but, is used to undermine and weaken the workers' movement in other parts of the country. And so, I think that building, a workers' movement in the South that can really build organization and power would have, would have numerous impacts, on workers across the country and really usher forward, a real transformation of society in, some pretty profound ways. I mean, I think, the other important part of this too is that the South is really the home base of, the most reactionary political currents in this country, who have been, throughout their existence, determined and focused on, breaking solidarity, on, kind of cultivating white supremacy and racism, on, weakening and diminishing workers' ability to organize. And so, to break through that, I think would really just kind of usher forward just some really tremendous and powerful changes, not only in the workplace, but in society more generally. And, I can imagine too that, when that happens, that, workers in other parts of the country would draw inspiration from the determination of workers here who, are battling, pretty challenging, inhospitable conditions, that are made even more inhospitable and challenging by, the kind of current, the crisis that, the working class is facing in this country as a result of, the various attacks that are coming down from the Trump administration and the billionaires. But, I think that it would just, I think there would be, workers everywhere would really draw powerful inspiration from that. And it would transform, the culture of organizing and really kind of, usher forward kind of a new direction for, labor and other types of social movement organizing and fights in this country.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. And now we can get to the subject at hand, which is the summit that's coming up. So Southern Workers Assembly is hosting the Southern Worker Action Summit June 13th through 15th in Spartanburg, South Carolina. So can you tell our listeners about the work that went into organizing the summit and, maybe what kind of workshops or educational presentations folks can look forward to if they attend?
Yeah, absolutely. Like you mentioned, the Southern Worker Action Summit will be held on June 13th to the 15th in Spartanburg, South Carolina. And the summit is the initiative of, the Southern Workers Assembly alongside 16 other worker organizations from across the South representing key sectors of workers in the region. And the motivation for organizing the summit, I mean, in years past, and actually, pretty much throughout the entirety of its history, the Southern Workers Assembly has generally hosted worker schools, which have been gatherings of the SWA network. Other unions have participated, sent delegations, and they've been, weekend long gatherings to do political discussion, political education, to exchange about, fights and struggles that, workers have been engaged in, and to try to advance some strategic thinking about how we're, unifying our work across the region, but particularly in light of, the crisis that workers are facing in this country with the attacks on not only our ability to organize our unions, as we've seen with, the attacks on federal workers, but also, the billionaires are really taking a hammer and, setting their sights on dismantling and tearing down, every measure of progress that's been won through struggle over the years. And so, we, and ourselves and the convening organizations thought that, it was important that we do something that was a bit broader and a bit more ambitious to kind of take on the challenges of the moment. And really, there's a lot of different things that are planned throughout the weekend. I mean, we'll be hearing from workers who've been engaged in various fights from different sectors against some of the attacks that have been coming down. We'll hear from workers who've been engaged in other, workplace fights, strikes, and there'll be a lot of space for, different kinds of exchanges for workers who've been engaged in various types of struggles to share their experiences and to help to encourage other workers to think about how they may apply some of that to their own workplaces and how, collectively we can, put the workers' movement in the South on a more fighting direction to really not only wage the defensive struggles we need to in this period, but really try to find opportunities to go on offense. And I think, the other kind of two key pieces of the weekend is that, we'll be really putting a big focus on the need to build organization among the unorganized. We'll be talking about, the workers' assembly approach. We'll be talking about salting or, workers getting jobs intentionally inside of workplaces to organize. And we'll be, sharing different kind of tactics and strategies in an effort to really try to arrive at some, collective direction about how we're prioritizing, various sectors, committee building efforts, network building, industrial councils across the region, and really leaving the weekend with some sense of how we're really developing infrastructure, how we're orienting towards more, engaging in more and broader fights in the workplace and, connecting that to the broader political climate in this period. I think another, a key piece of the weekend is going to be, really building solidarity. So we'll have, we'll be hearing from immigrant workers from various sectors who will be speaking about their organizing, the impacts of the attacks on migrant workers on their sector and ways other workers can, join in solidarity in the fights that are happening right now. A couple of other pieces of programming will have, different kind of full group plenary discussions. We'll have workshop breakouts. Public Rail Now will be doing a workshop, which we're super excited about. The Emergency Workplace Organizing Committee will be doing an organizing training during it. Several groups, including the Union of Southern Service Workers, El Futuro es Nuestro, which organizes agricultural workers in North Carolina, UE 150, Carolina Amazonians United for Solidarity and Empowerment are planning a Black and Brown unity discussion during the summit. There's also a workshop discussion on building strike power. So hearing from workers who've engaged in strikes and other collective actions about how they organized and carried out those activities, and how other workers, particularly in this period, can be thinking about, engaging in those kinds of more militant, tactics in this, in the midst of the attacks and the kind of period that we find ourselves in. And through it, and, another piece too that we're pretty excited about is that we'll be having different sector strategy meetings and state strategy meetings on Saturday afternoon. And, throughout the gathering, we're going to have a lot of culture, a lot of different cultural presentations, performances, movement, a lot of time for workers to really exchange and, talk to and connect with one another, all towards, building a broader movement, building infrastructure that can, turn the tide on the conditions in the region and push back against the attacks that are happening right now. I think too, in addition, and I'm biased obviously, but I think that, the programming should be very powerful. Something we generally hear from workers who come to the schools that we organize, or, other kinds of, gatherings or conferences that we participate in, is just being in a room, particularly in the South, with other workers who are just like you, who are organizing and fighting at their own workplace. There's a sense of power that comes with that. There's a sense of really breaking out of the isolation that can so often come from, the day-to-day work inside of your own workplace, your own community, and really kind of, feeling that power and feeling that kind of strength of being in a room, with a bunch of other workers who are going through the same fights that you are is so sustaining and rejuvenating, and really helps to carry us forward for the tasks, that lay in front of us. So it should be a really powerful weekend. We want to invite, Southern workers to come and join us there. And folks can find more information on what's planned, kind of general FAQs and the link to register at southernworker.org/summit.
Something that really excites me about the upcoming summit is that it tackles working class issues beyond the sort of bread and butter economism that's so prevalent in a lot of unionism today. So we're talking about Black liberation, economic justice, queer labor, fighting attacks on migrant workers, international labor solidarity, all of these struggles that are critical to the overall class struggle. And why is it important for people to understand the interconnectedness of all these struggles, and how does the Southern Workers Assembly promote this understanding in its organizing?
Yeah, I mean, it's critical. It's, as we were talking about before, so often, bosses are using racism or using sexism or using these different forms of social oppression to keep workers divided, and to really be in a space to really challenge that kind of thinking, or develop our own thinking and see the ways that, our fights are connected and to really bring to life, a slogan, we are the many and they are the few, to really kind of take that to heart and to feel that kind of solidarity, and that kind of unity is really what's going to build the type of movement, that we need, that can in the long term really challenge capital, that can build organization, and that can transform society. So we think, we can't separate out these issues. The issues, the broader, the ways that racism, sexism, et cetera, impact workers, obviously express themselves in the workplace. And they also don't end, when workers clock in or clock out of work, And so, really taking on these fights, it's showing how, racism and sexism and various forms of social oppression, are meant to keep workers divided to the benefit of the boss, who's exploiting all of us, is really what we think is needed to really build kind of a higher level of consciousness, and build a type of movement that can actually challenge and win in the long term. And, I'm glad you mentioned the international piece. We're very excited about the international panel that'll have workers from Mexico, Canada, Palestine, and perhaps a few other countries that we're, still working on. But really, again, kind of this piece where, particularly right now, but it's not, limited to just this current moment that we find ourselves in, is that, so often, politicians and big business will, pit workers against each other in different countries, whether it's moving production somewhere, the attacks on migrants that's happening right now, or, whatever kinds of forms it takes. So, in the same sense, to kind of build that sense that, workers across the country are engaged in the same fight, that we have a lot more in common with workers in Mexico or in Canada or, wherever in any part of the world than with our boss or with the politicians, is, we think, pretty essential to building, again, the type of movement that we need that can really challenge in a long-term sense, the domination of capital of the South and, and of society in general. I think in a lot of respects, it goes back, to some of what we were talking about earlier, that, we look through history or, Operation Dixie, but we don't even have to go back, that far. But, when the workplace organizing is confined, to these very limited, narrow set of kind of immediate issues, it doesn't build the type of consciousness. It doesn't build the type of, struggles that are needed in a long-term sense to really win and sustain, the organizing that we need to, beat back against the decades of repression, the repression that's happening right now. And in order to, forge ahead and build, power in the workplace and in society more generally.
Definitely. And Ben, thank you so much again for your time. And I'd love to get you back on the program sometime in the future. But before we go, again, where can folks go to learn more about the Southern Workers Assembly, and where can folks go to get registered to attend the Southern Worker Action Summit?
Yeah, thanks so much again for having me. And folks can visit our website. It's southernworker.org/summit. And on that page, you'll find all kinds of information about what's planned for the weekend, a link to register, and more. And if anybody has any questions or wants to get more information, they can also send us an email at info@southernworker.org.